So this cuddly snowman over my shoulder is a symbol, an allegory, if you will, for an abomination. The tariff of abominations. And this is the piece of legislation that caused the nullification crisis. Right, so the tariff of abominations was actually a tariff created by John Quincy Adams. Yet another example of how the Democratic Republicans had increasingly become like the Federalists, because the tariff of abominations was very high. Now, it was called the tariff of abominations by South Carolina and other southern states. It was, of course, not called that by the people that created it, right? So the Quincy Adams administration creates this high tariff as part of essentially enacting the American system, higher tariffs to pay for infrastructure. Of course, we know the South really does not like high tariffs because it makes costs of imported goods higher, and it likely causes counter tariffs from Europe against American exports, and the primary American export at this time was cotton. So the South is going to oppose this tariff for a number of reasons, but this tariff becomes a symbol for the South's true anxiety, which is slavery. So here we have South Carolina, one of the most uppity states in American history. As we hopefully remember, this is a state that has a very profound hierarchy, and one in which there's always been a very high percentage of slaves, and one that's been very, very dedicated to the system of slavery. Right? John Calhoun, the Vice President of the United States, was from South Carolina. Right? And he supported the decision by the South Carolina legislature to nullify the tariff. Now, we've talked about nullification before in the context of Virginia and Kentucky. The difference is that Virginia and Kentucky didn't do it. South Carolina does it. So this is known as the nullification crisis. South Carolina said, sorry, federal government, we reject your law. And of course, they did it using the constitutional theory known as compact theory, that the government was only as strong as the agreement between the states. South Carolina did not agree to this tariff, therefore it was nullified. And this is really significant because it calls into question the power of the federal government. Right? And this signifies the rupture between John Calhoun and Andrew Jackson. They had been best friends. They were running mates in 1828. And indeed, Calhoun was the vice president. But they had been having a falling out, both over this tariff issue, but also over issues in Washington. Specifically, the Peggy Eaton affair. It's a fascinating example of the way that gender issues actually play into national politics. John Calhoun's wife, Floride, here she is on the right. Floride Calhoun was sort of like the alpha female of the Washington, D.C. social set. And she was extremely just really kind of unpleasant towards a young woman named Peggy Eaton. Peggy Eaton was married to the then Secretary of War. She had been previously married, and Floride Calhoun accused her of all sorts of unladylike attributes, including being of easy virtue. Not a nice thing to say about a lady. Now, Andrew Jackson, whose own wife had died shortly after the election of 1824, and Jackson was convinced that she died of a broken heart because she was so disparaged by propaganda from opposing political parties or political groups that Calhoun came to the aid of Peggy Eaton and was quite angry at Floride Calhoun and therefore her husband John. So the Peggy Eaton affair, a spat between ladies in D.C., helps to contribute to the rupture between Calhoun and Jackson. But the true rupture between Calhoun and Jackson comes over nullification. Calhoun wants to nullify. Jackson recognizes that nullification is just one step away from secession and is a true danger to the strength of the Union. So Andrew Jackson famously threatens to invade South Carolina. In fact, he goes so far as to pass legislation, the Force Bill, authorizing him to use force to compel South Carolina to honor the tariff. Now, this is when Henry Clay enters the picture and helps negotiate the first of multiple compromises. One of Henry Clay's nicknames is the Great Compromiser because he is able to solve numerous problems between the various sections of America. Here he steps in and he gets South Carolina to acknowledge the tariff if Andrew Jackson lowers the tariff. And Jackson was happy to lower the tariff because he was a Democrat and he didn't like high tariffs anyway. Right? But this gave both Calhoun and Jackson an out, allowing them to save face without any kind of conflict happening. But this incident cements the rupture between Andrew Jackson, who is into states' rights but still believes in the federal government's power, and John Calhoun, who's willing to do absolutely anything, including nullification and including secession, to protect slavery. And thus John Calhoun starts a new branch of Jackson haters that find themselves allied with the more traditional big government Whig party. Those Jackson haters are called states' rights Whigs. The most famous examples are John Calhoun and John Tyler. And the states' rights Whigs stem directly from Jackson's protection of the federal government during the nullification crisis.